This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello everyone, welcome to Living History and an episode I'm really looking forward to because we're continuing on our journey through World War II. We've done a lot of World War II stuff lately and I'm so happy because during the centenary years recently there's been so much focus on the First World War, which is not a bad thing. That's a place very close to my heart. But I think it's also important that we remember the Second World War and don't become too one-eyed about just remembering the First World War, particularly in Australia. So I'm really enjoying this journey through the history of some of these great World War II battles. And today we've got another really exciting one. We're going to be talking about Operation Market Garden, the great invasion of Holland that took place during the Second World War. And joining us to discuss that is someone that people who've travelled on our tours would know very, very well. It's Joe Hook, and Joe is a wonderful battlefield historian who does a lot of tours for us and is just an expert on lots of aspects of war and remembrance from the First World War through to the Second World War, and she's really a great member of the team. So it's really wonderful to be talking to her about a battlefield that I know she is very passionate about. So Joe, thanks very much for joining us on Living History.
No problem, it's a pleasure.
Operation Market Garden, it's a very controversial battle. It was not a victory for the Allies at a time when we probably should have had victory after victory. Can we start by you giving us just your brief overview of how this battle came to be and what happened during Operation Market Garden?
Yeah, sure. I think you have to go back to Normandy, really. Once we'd broken out of Normandy, things started to move very quickly. And gradually, as troops began to move quicker and quicker, I mean, the Brits were in Paris by August. The Americans, they were fighting on a broad front, so the Americans to their right were doing virtually the same thing. And it was almost like the media was beginning to think that the German army were in a rout, that they were completely destroyed. And also the intelligence we had coming through from, say, the Belgian resistance in Belgium was saying sort of like the Germans are retreating using whatever means of transport they can. And so there started to be this belief that we could actually end the war by Christmas. And I think it was the 5th of September 1944 was known as Dolze Dinsdag, Mad Tuesday. And so all the media were revealing this sort of like this rout by the German army. And gradually this victory fever prevailed, that actually we could be into Berlin by Christmas. And so I think in a way people became a little bit complacent, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely it does. So that's a fascinating backstory that you think that Market Garden came about because of overconfidence and poor intelligence on the part of the Allies.
Well, in some ways it did. I mean, we also had the other thing that we had going is we had two airborne divisions, the 1st Airborne Division and the 6th Airborne Division. Now, the 6th Airborne Division had been used in Normandy, and the 1st Airborne Division had been kept at home in reserve. And there was also this feeling that we need to use an airborne division because of all the training that's gone into them, that it would be a waste not to use them. But because the ground troops were moving so quickly, every single operation that the 1st Airborne Division would have been involved in was cancelled. And if you go into the war records, you can see operation after operation cancelled and crossed out. So there was this feeling that we've got to use this airborne division before probably the war is over. So there was that feeling prevaricated as well.
Well, it's a really good point because when you think about the use of airborne troops, even though they can get to a location relatively quickly, once they're in there, due to a lack of support, they become fairly static, don't they? The airborne troops have to be used well in advance of the moving front line, which is why you can see that this sort of operation to drop troops effectively behind German lines in Holland had so much appeal.
Yeah, and they have to drop onto objectives until relieved. But that relief, as you quite correctly stated, because they don't have the heavy armoured support, that relief has to come quickly. And so therefore this whole feeling with this sort of like the ground forces moving so quickly and literally the Germans retreating and retreating, that this plan could go ahead, because it wouldn't take very long before those airborne troops that had been dropped on their objectives would have been relieved. But at the same time, the British ground troops were moving further and further away from their lines of supply. So their lines of supply were becoming elasticated. And then you have the whole political thing with Eisenhower, who is the supreme commander over all the troops. He politically, it doesn't look good for him not to be backing the Americans led by Patton. But he also has to sort of like play the middleman between Patton for the Americans and Montgomery for the British, and sort of like be the middleman and almost like the liaison between the two of them. So he has quite a difficult position to be in, and at the back of his mind, we've got ground troops moving so quickly. I mean, some of them were even outstripping the maps that they had with them, and also we have to use these airborne divisions. So he had a lot on his plate as well, if that makes sense.
Absolutely, and given that incredibly complicated situation, in steps Monty and comes up with this plan for Market Garden. Tell us what the plan was.
Well, the plan was to drop. Initially, it came on the back of 17 other plans, and the plan before it was called Operation, correct me if I'm wrong, Operation Comet, and that would use one airborne division to land on different bridges, objectives, for want of a better expression, so that they could hold those bridges, so that ground troops could advance through from the Belgian-Dutch border up through the Netherlands, and then effectively sweep right into the industrial heartland of Germany, the Ruhr Valley, where it was believed was ideal terrain for a tank battle, and we could be into Berlin before Christmas. That was the idea. And the one thing that was probably held in Montgomery's favour at the time was that at the beginning of September 1944, London experienced the first V2, this huge rocket. And because of morale on the home front, it was suggested that this be covered up and actually it's be fed out to the public as a gas explosion. But behind the scenes, we knew that the German army had these weapons of mass destruction, and they were also on Montgomery's chosen path to land this airborne carpet and to speed ground troops through this airborne corridor. So that was another thing in Monty's favour that gave him the onus really over Patton in Eisenhower's eyes.
So Monty's got these quite well-founded reasons for wanting to move the advance forward quickly, to capture these bridges over the Rhine, to speed up the advance into Germany. So what was this great plan he came up with that would eventually be Market Garden? Okay,
so the plan was to land 3 airborne divisions, 2 American, the 101st and 82nd, and 1 British airborne division, the 1st Airborne Division, onto major objectives, bridges crossing the main riverways that flow from east to west through the Netherlands, starting off at the Belgian border. Now, by the time those 3 airborne divisions have dropped, which would eventually be about 2 p.m. on the 17th of September, the ground troops, namely 30 Corps, led by a guy called General Horrocks, would advance in the hope that they would reach the apex of where the bridges were being held by the 1st Airborne Division in about 48 hours. And as they advanced, those bridges would be being held by those 3 airborne divisions. That was the overall plan. Once they'd crossed all the bridges, the airborne divisions would then come under the command of 30 Corps, and together with the 52nd Lowland Division, who were due to drop in north of Arnhem itself, then 30 Corps could roll on through and head east through the heartland of the war and knock the Germans out that way.
The one thing that always strikes me, Joe, when I read about Market Garden is it was a plan that relied on absolutely everything going right, because we have this situation where you're dropping airborne troops on bridges to secure them so that the Germans couldn't blow them up, so that would open up a pathway into Germany. And then you had this huge ground force that would roll up the very narrow roads of that part of Europe to relieve the airborne troops who couldn't, as you said before, who couldn't hold on for very long as they didn't have much armour or artillery with them. It was a plan, whenever I read about it, that relied on absolutely everything going right. And if the slightest thing went wrong, there was a huge risk of the whole thing falling apart. Do you think that's a fair assessment?
Yeah, I do think that's a fair assessment. I also think that it was far too ambitious a plan, because the ground troops, we were literally outstripping our supply lines. One of the main problems that happened was supply at that point was still coming in some cases via the Normandy beaches. And what the 30 Corps failed to do, because they had so elasticated their supply lines, they got to the Scheldt Estuary, which is in Antwerp, just by the Belgian-Dutch border. And they took the port of Antwerp, but they failed to take the main riverway, the estuary going into it. And without that, it was mined. In doing so, they were so exhausted, and it allowed something like, I think it was something like 10,000 German troops to get across the Scheldt and make their way back to Germany to provide reinforcements for the opposing force when the airborne divisions dropped and when the ground troops moved out. Had they taken that estuary, the Scheldt Estuary that leads into the port of Antwerp, it's possible they could have got supply in there. And that was, in my opinion, and Market Garden is a battle of what ifs, in my opinion, that was a major failure. And Horrocks, who commands 30 Corps, retrospectively looks back on that and said, we should have taken the port of Antwerp and the Scheldt Estuary, but they didn't. But you're quite correct in saying it relied on everything going perfectly to plan and communications being perfect. But what happened was, certainly from the airborne side, the overall commander of the airborne divisions was a guy called Brereton, and he made the ruling that once this plan goes to paper, it doesn't change. And the reason he made that suggestion or gave that order was that if that plan had changed on paper, it would have taken too long to disseminate that change to all the airborne divisions when they were already some in the air, some already on the ground. So he stated, when that goes to paper, it doesn't change, it goes ahead. But you're correct, there were so many what-ifs and so many things that could go wrong, which did go wrong in the end. But in my opinion, I think it's a plan that possibly shouldn't have happened. It's good on paper, but as you know, once things actually come off the paper and go into operations, things rarely go as you would want them to.
Absolutely. And as we've said, it's a complicated plan and things didn't go according to plan. Can you give us an overview of what actually happened once the battle unfolded?
Well, probably, certainly with the airborne divisions, that it was going to be a bottom to top plan. So it was reliant on the 101st Airborne Division dropping, and they were the southernmost drops. And it was reliant on them actually seizing their objectives as quickly as they could. So they were given, they dropped over a day in itself, whereas right at the top of the airborne plan were the 1st British Division, who had the problems of having to drop over 3 days. They didn't drop on their objectives. So if you compare that with, say, Pegasus Bridge in Normandy, where the Oxenbucks landed right on the bridge, this didn't happen with the British. They had to drop 8 miles to the west of the Arnhem Bridge, which meant they had to forego the element of surprise. Intelligence at the time was something that we had the intelligence. We knew there was the 2nd SS Panzer Corps were in the area, but we believed they had been so battered because they'd gone all the way through from Normandy all the way through to the north, or to Arnhem, to the north of Holland, and were in the process of re-equipping, refitting, and sending back some of their armour to Germany, that though we knew that they were there, we believed it was no more than a brigade strength. One of the other problems that happened with Market Garden was the British hesitance to rely on the Dutch intelligence. Now, Dutch intelligence had been compromised earlier on in the war, and we weren't so much heavily reliant because of our suspicions about Dutch intelligence cells being compromised, as we would have been reliant on, say, French intelligence. Communications was a huge problem, and a lot of people, if you watch the film A Bridge Too Far, and being an ex-Royal Signals person, in the film they say, it's all about the crystals in the radios, which are part of the radios. Even when I was serving with the reserve forces, say 20 years ago, if we took a radio out of and did a practice with it and then actually went on exercise with it, the chances are a lot of the time it wouldn't work. So radios and the training of signallers at the time was still very much, by World War II standards, very much sort of in its infancy. You take a radio and you put it in a glider on the back of a Jeep, or you strap it onto the back of a guy as a man pack, and then you chuck them all out of a plane, for want of a better expression, and the chances are they may not work. There's probably quite a good chance they won't work. The radios at the time were reliant on batteries, and when the British were holding out, as they would be when their objectives hadn't been taken or hadn't been held, those batteries were meant to come in with the supply runs, and at the time the supplies were dropping outside the area that the British were held, and so they couldn't get their supplies because the Germans were all getting them. It's kind of a catalogue of errors. I could go on forever, but you wouldn't want to be here for another 3 hours, I guess.
Well, you're absolutely right, Joe, what you're saying, and I think it's such a big and sprawling and complicated and in some ways farcical battle that I think I'd encourage everyone to go and look it up and check it out on the internet and read about it, because there's just so many elements to this. I know Anthony Beaver, I think last year, released an excellent book about it called Arnhem. And it, as you say, it's a catalogue of errors. But basically, the summation, even though the battle went on for several weeks, the summation is the airborne troops successfully in most cases got at least close to the bridges they were supposed to get to, but 30 Corps could not get through in time to support them due to unexpected German resistance and narrow roads and a whole host of problems. And that road they were driving up, really the single road that leads into this part of Holland, became known as Hell's Highway, didn't it?
Yes, sure. And even today, you can go up, we quite often do a tour that goes right up from the Belgian border and follows, they called it the corridor, but it follows part of Hell's Highway. So a lot of it has been built over now, and as towns have sort of like expanded, a lot of it is lost. But certainly if you go up from Lommel, which was the first bridge, really the start point for 30 Corps, a place called Joe's Bridge, you go up towards the town of Valkenswaard, you can see either side where if the road, I mean, if you're on it, there's no getting off it. And if what the German army did was they formed these ad hoc battalions, and they adopted a policy known as mission command, where if you're just a lance corporal, but you know what you're supposed to do, a lance corporal maybe with a section of men with him, all you need is sort of like an anti-tank weapon. And once you don't actually have to destroy one of the tanks, you just have to stop them moving so they block the road, and it stops the whole advance. And this is what they kept doing. They kept infiltrating, stopping the vehicles, 30 Corps vehicles moving up the road. So this caused more and more delay as they were trying to get up there. The poor old First British Airborne Division actually held Arnhem Bridge for something like 72 hours when they were literally had been told you'd probably be holding that bridge for no more than 48 hours because of this complacency, because of this thought that we'd won the war and the Germans would literally be retreating, and it would be sort of like a piece of cake to get into Germany before and end war before Christmas.
And the summary is, as I said, I think people, please go and read about all these incredible little actions that occurred all over the place during Market Garden. But the upshot was that the Americans did well in the south, the 101st. The 82nd Airborne did well to take the bridge at Nijmegen, but the poor old Brits up north held on as long as they could in the town of Arnhem before being overrun by the Germans and either killed or captured. Is that a fair summary of the results of Market Garden?
It's a fair summary. I would say sort of the 82nd Airborne Division, they had quite a lot of problems because they had their drop zones and landing zones. They had the largest drop and landing zones to defend. And their glider pilots, so you have two different kinds of airborne troops. You have parachutists and then you have glider-borne troops. And their glider pilots, the glider-borne troops, once the pilots got on the ground, they weren't used in any other for any other reason. Whereas for the 1st British Airborne Division, their glider pilots, glider pilot regiment, became double-hatted. When they got onto the ground, they became infantry soldiers as well. So they were utilised throughout the battle. And I think at Nijmegen, had not 82nd Airborne Division also had the support of the Grenadier Guards, who were part of 30 Corps, they would probably have never got over Nijmegen Bridge because they didn't have that armour to support them. But by the time really Nijmegen Bridge was taken, then there was hardly any defences left further north at the Arnhem Bridge. And once the Arnhem Bridge had fallen, the British were blocked by the elements of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, who had literally blocked them on all sides and were pushing them into a circular enclave that was known as the Hexenkassel, the Witch's Cauldron, or known more locally to the British as the perimeter. And you can still walk the perimeter today, and it's no more than about a kilometre from east to west and no more than 2 kilometres north to south. And gradually, as supplies, because our supplies were still dropping in the places we were meant to be, which by that time had been overrun by the German army. So effectively, our supplies were dropping into German hands. And as the casualties mounted, this perimeter became fluid. And so gaps were created as virtually the 1st British Airborne Division became depleted until eventually they really had no other option, although if you asked a lot of the veterans there saying they said we should have held on, but really they had no other option but to evacuate back across the Rhine.
Thank you for that overview of Market Garden. As we said, it's very complicated and so much went wrong. It was a bit of a disaster for the Allies, wasn't it? It was the Germans saw this as a great victory relatively late in their war. It was probably the last effective German victory on the Western Front, wasn't it? Yeah. I think the one thing we can look at it provided, because by the end of Market Garden we'd taken Nijmegen, and it provided the springboard for the Rhine crossings later on in 45. And certainly a lot of the problems had been ironed out because of what happened at Market Garden. And there's sort of two schools of thought. I mean, Montgomery says it was 90% successful, and to the point that it provided that ground and that springboard for further crossings later on. I suppose you could call that a success, but really the operation itself, it had so many elements of it that were a disaster. Joe, why do you think it's important to remember this battle today? Why is Market Garden still worth remembering 75 years down the track? For me, personally, it's because it's a battle of what-ifs. The British Airborne Division, certainly up at Arnhem, and if
speaking as a Brit myself, if you're British, a lot of us go to and just look at the 1st British Airborne Division. But if you look at the whole battlefield, it's a fascinating battlefield. But for the 1st British Airborne Division, they were there for 9 days. And it's this story of grit, it's this story of where so many things went wrong. You can stand there on the ground for a long time and argue, well, what if they'd done this and what if they'd done that? And I've had conversations with other historians, where do you think the failure was? And there's always, yeah, but then there was this and then there was that. It's just a really fascinating battle. And because the ground is relatively easy ground to cover, and certainly if you get up to Oosterbeek, which is where the 1st British Airborne Division eventually were pushed into this perimeter pocket, a lot of the ground hasn't changed. So a lot of the photography from the time, a lot of the news clips from the time, you can stand in the perimeter there and just play it, and you hear in the background German anti-tank gunfire and anti-aircraft fire going off, and if you close your eyes, you can imagine you're there. It's just a really exciting kind of, gripping battlefield. I love it.
It's got a lot of elements in common, I think, with the story of Gallipoli in some ways. That things went wrong. There's so many what ifs. I know the landscape is not similar, but in terms of just standing on a battlefield and imagining how things could have gone differently, there's actually quite a few similarities with Gallipoli in that respect.
Exactly, and there's a few sort of coincidentals in that both operations started on a Sunday, which is, okay, no bigger coincidence. But also General Urquhart, who commanded the 1st Airborne Division, the only successful thing really about the Gallipoli campaign was the evacuation. And Urquhart, when he had planned his evacuation on the night of the 25th, 26th September 44, he had learnt about the evacuation from Gallipoli at Staff College, and he based it on exactly the same thing. So there are sort of like elements of it where you sort of think, okay, 2 operations, disaster, successful evacuation, and they are quite closely linked and make similarities between the two.
That's extraordinary. I didn't know that direct connection between Gallipoli and Market Garden. Joe, over the years, you had the privilege of speaking to veterans from this campaign, didn't you? What was their opinion on the success or otherwise of Market Garden? How did they feel to have been involved in this great operation?
I don't think I ever got their opinion of the success, or whether it was successful or whether it was not. There's certainly a pride at having been there. And there's a lovely friend of mine, unfortunately he died last year. He was in the glider pilot regiment, and his name was Peter Clark. And how I got to know him was he grew up certainly a generation apart from me, but just down the road from where I lived. And he used to ride his bike down Saltbox Hill, which is right by Biggin Hill, about a generation before I did. And he has an extraordinary story, and he was a perfect gentleman, but he was with the glider pilot regiment, and when they eventually landed, he took the 1st Border Regiment in. Those were the glider troops that he took in, and when he got on the ground, he changed roles and became a medic. So he survived Market Garden, but when the evacuation, they were called to evacuate, he had the moral dilemma: do I stay with the wounded or do I evacuate? Because he had the choice, and he chose to stay with the wounded. He eventually got taken prisoner along with many of the other elements of the 1st Airborne Division, and he went to one of the Stalag prisoner of war camps, and he kept a diary which was totally against the rules all the time that he was in that camp. And when I knew him, when he was in his 80s, he said to me in a very clipped English voice, "Joe, I must get this transcribed one day." And I can type, I've got a computer. So I said, "Peter, I will do that for you." And so in the UK, we have a a website called Paradata, where all the data from all the different battles that the airborne divisions have been involved in are stored. And so that's now there in perpetuity. But he kept this diary, and it was just little things like conditions in prison camps. He was a very religious man, was Peter. But he had this pride in that up until only about 2 years ago, he was still going out with young soldiers of today to speak to them about his experiences. And I don't know whether he enjoyed his war. Some of the veterans, they're quite reticent about talking about that, but he certainly had a pride in what he did. And I was very proud to have been a friend of his.
It's just so wonderful, those connections with veterans, isn't it? I've said this a lot on the podcast recently. I'm feeling the loss, the fact that we have no World War I veterans left, and we're losing the World War II veterans at an astonishing rate. And I think we will be the poorer for it. I think it will be a different world when all those World War II veterans are gone. And I'd encourage anyone listening to this who wants to know more about veterans to go back to the podcasts we've done previously. For example, with Peter Hart, who has spent most of his working life, the last 40 years, interviewing World War I and World War II veterans. And it's just such an important aspect to our understanding of what went on, isn't it, Joe?
It certainly is. And those little snippets of history that we're lucky enough as historians to go out with the veterans, and you might just get a little snippet of history that is not written in any of the books. And for me, I feel that if I can go out and tell that story and pass those little snippets on to passengers from either Matt McLaughlin Tours or whatever tour company, then that's passing on that legacy. There's so many stories, so many. There's a great story about a set of brothers, and they were twins, and they came from Cornwall and were miners, so in a reserved occupation. And they were killed on the railway track that bends round from Arnhem into Nijmegen. They'd gone to try and take the railway bridge, which was another objective for the 1st Airborne Division. And both of them, as brothers, were killed on that railway track. And you can still go to Oosterbeek War Cemetery today, buried side by side, the Grunart twins, and their numbers, their army numbers are sequential, and obviously as twins they were born the same day and died the same day. Little stories like that, and other little stories that have come to me from veterans, direct from sort of like hand to mouth, stories that I think we should keep going and pass on so that other people keep that going. That legacy is a big responsibility, I think.
Just those little snippets of information are just absolutely heartbreaking. And whenever you study any battle like this, particularly a big one like Market Garden, there must just be thousands of little stories that never even come to light. Joe, you have led possibly hundreds of people across these battlefields. What are the little corners you most like visiting? Where do you go to tell the story? Where do you feel the strongest connection to the history?
There's two places, the twins where they got the story I've just told you, and then there's a wonderful letter written by a young man called Ivor Robury, and he's buried in Oosterbeek Commonwealth War Grave Cemetery as well, from Market Garden. And he talks about, in his letter, he's not fighting for king and country, he's fighting for his mother, for his friends in Wolverhampton, his friends at home. And he said to me, and he says in the letter, he says, "I loved you, Mum, you were the best mother in the world." And I stand and read that letter, and it's a letter that never fails to move you. And he was just one young man among many who probably thought when they went out on this airborne operation, receiving all the propaganda from the papers at home that the war was nearly over, that this was going to be a walk in the park and he'd be coming home. And he never did come home. And it's those little stories. So those places I like to go, especially with Market Garden. I like to wander around the perimeter. So if you get into the woodland, the ground hasn't changed. You can still see the foxholes in there if you know where to look. The trees still bear the scarring from the bullet marks and that have when they were younger trees, so the bark, you can still see where the fighting took place. Get out in the woods by yourself. Those are the places I like to be if I'm on my own. But also if I can take people there, because as I said, I feel especially it's a responsibility for me to carry that legacy on, to ensure that it's not forgotten.
That's very well said, Joe. And I tell you what, you've encouraged me to come over and walk the ground with you, because I've only done a very small part of Market Garden, and I'd love to do more. If you are listening to this and you're interested in going yourselves, we do have tours throughout the year that go to Market Garden and explore this area in depth with either Joe or one of our other great historians. It's particularly good if you're doing a river cruise through Europe, because so many river cruises begin or end in Amsterdam, so it's a very easy add-on to that. So visit our website at battlefields.com.au if you want some more information about that. But Joe, thank you so much for joining us. It's been really wonderful, and just a fabulous insight into yet another really intriguing chapter of military history.
Great to talk to you.